What's going on, golf fans? It's your boy Gsluke here with our DFS and prop preview for what I think is one of the more underrated weeks of golf we have the entire year. And first off, the Hero World Challenge, but also two events on the DP World Tour side at stellar golf courses. So here in this preview, going to get you ready for all of your exposure this week with any questions that you've got in the live chat, but also a look at the weather report over the next few days. We'll talk ownership for all 20 players that are teeing it up this week, a little bit of lineup construction notes, and then towards the second half of this live stream, we're going to go through the underdog and the prize pick side. Also, a few matchup bets on the sports books to help give you some exposure for round one. But hopefully this week is treating everyone nicely. We've got some golf to sweat out, and it's our last really big week of the year, so let's make it count. And we got Jay down there with a question that we'll go through later, Jay Bonzo as well. And like you said, let's end 2025 with a bang. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get this thing going. So we're first off going to talk the golf course, which if you want a full course breakdown, I do already have a video up on my channel of that, so you guys can check that out after you guys watch this live stream. But this golf course is extremely well-rounded, and it's a lot harder than I think it looks on paper, because when you look at the scoring average, it's by -2, maybe even -2.5 for most years. But you've got to remember that these are the world's best players. The top 20 are normally teeing it up at this event. So because of that, the scoring average is going to be a bit better than what it actually is if it were a regular tour event. And because of that, you've got some small greens, some really tricky around the green shots. It is Bermuda grass from tip to toe. Power does matter around here. You do have 5 par 5s. That is something that's unique about Albany Golf Club. And also you have 3, maybe even 4 drivable par 4s. So there's a few things that you can use to really boost your game. That'd be driving distance around the green, as we mentioned, because of that really grainy Bermuda grass. And then that's probably about it. Those are really the main two things I'm looking at. You could add in some birdie or better percentage. It is normally one at like -20 to -25, but that would probably be getting a little bit too cute. I really simplify my model for some of these weeks, especially when we only have 20 players in the field. And it's a lot more about ownership and actually building lineups that have a chance in GPPs, which more on that a little bit later in this live stream. The next thing I want to look at would be the weather for Thursday and for Friday. And because we do only have 20 players in the field, there's not going to be a big window for any sort of weather edge. So if there's a kind of crazy weather trend that we have for a single round, maybe you could use it for showdown, but even then that's probably a little bit dicey. It's more so important to know with the kind of players that we want to target. We want to know whether it's going to play easier, maybe harder than what we have compared to most years. And based on the weather forecast, it looks like a pretty average forecast, something close to 10 miles an hour sustained, wind gusts that are 10 to maybe 15 miles an hour over the first couple days. And we're going to use the GFS just because it is actually loaded in for Thursday and for Friday. You can see a similar trend like what we had with the HRRR, but then on Friday, maybe slightly windier conditions than what we had for Thursday, but nothing that's all that drastic. I mean, there are times where it's 25 miles an hour sustained, 35 miles an hour gusts like we get at these coastal golf courses, but there's also years where it's completely calm. You're talking about sub 5 miles an hour sustained, wind gusts that are sub 10 miles an hour for the first couple rounds. It's not going to be quite that easy, but it's certainly not going to be a difficult setup for the first couple days. So I think something close to that -1.5, maybe -2 scoring average that we saw for last year is going to be pretty in par with what we see here in 2025, which, going back to the actual skill set that we're using for our players, doesn't change it very much. That was kind of what we were expecting. These are run-of-the-mill conditions for what we can get at the Hero World Challenge. And obviously Saturday, Sunday, it could change a bit, but because we're so far out from the Saturday, Sunday forecast, we can't look at them as accurately as what we have for the first couple of days. So we're going to zoom out. We're going to look at Saturday or Sunday just as the entire day for these two models. You can see that there's wind there on Saturday. On Sunday, even some overnight rain, and then pretty similar forecast to what we had on Thursday and Friday on Sunday. So it's never going to be completely calm, and it's never going to be a complete washout either. So I think that sort of course read is going to be rather consistent from Thursday and through Sunday, which simplifies things when we're looking for certain players this week. The next thing I'm going to go through would be ownership. And because there's only 20 players in the field, we're going to go through all of them. And we're also going to go through any questions that you have during this section as well. So if there's any player pool deep dives that you've got, feel free to let me know now so we can do the full deep dive. You've got shots gained metrics over the last 24 and the last 12 rounds that we can use for that. Event history, recent form, which isn't that substantial for a lot of the guys that are teeing it up, as a vast majority of them have taken off almost all of the fall swing. But we've got a lot of data points that we can use to go through here. But the main thing that we're going to go through will be this ownership tab. As you guys can see, is completely filled out for the slate to give you an idea of where the field is going. But we had that question from Jay before about the player pool, asking with just a 20-player field how many guys you should have in your player pool. That is completely dependent on how many lineups you're entering, because if you're only entering 2 to 3 lineups, you should probably keep it pretty tight to 7 or 8 golfers. Whereas if you're 150 max golfer, you might want all 20 players in your player pool. So I think it really depends on how many lineups you're entering, but even on top of that, how aggressive you're going to be, because there'll be 150 maxers this week, plenty of them, in fact, that will play all 20 golfers and just adjust their exposures over and under the field for how much they like those guys. And then there's people like myself entering 150 lineups that are a little bit more convicted about the stands that I'm taking, where I'm going to have 0% of some guys. I'm going to be over the field on others, closer to that 12 to maybe 13 player pool. It all depends on your exposure and how aggressive you want to be about it. I would say I've got the aggressive 150 maxer strategy of only having this 12 to 13 players. The more conservative, and maybe the one that's, not as crazy as what I'm going with this week, would be to actually play all 20. So you'll have to answer that for yourself. Depends on how many lineups you're going with. But if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to let me know. Let's go through this ownership. So as expected, number one with ownership this week would be a Scotty Scheffler. We could have told you that ahead of time, even though he was $15,000, but he's only, and I'll put only in quotes, 48% owned. And this is for the large hole GPP. And I do think that the dynamic might look a little bit different in single entries. The reason why in GPPs, the ownership's more spread out and guys like Scotty won't be 65 to 70% owned, like I think he might be in some single entries, is because people play the game theory edge. We talk about this all the time. In fact, that's why we're going through the ownership right now, is so that we know where the rest of the field is, so that we can adjust and try and play accordingly with our lineups. Guys like Scotty Scheffler aren't 65 to 70% owned in GPPs because of a lot of the field using that mindset. Whereas in single entries and cash, because there's less lineups that you're playing against, you have an infinitely less chance of actually duplicating yourself with somebody else. That's why you can afford to play a Scotty Scheffler a lot more in those sort of builds. And because of that, it's a feedback loop. If you guys are familiar with that, that sort of feedback loop makes them a lot higher owned in those sort of contests. So that's what's worth noting about guys like Scotty, is that I think in some of the single entries, he might be even higher owned than what we see here. And that's going to take away ownership from guys like McIntyre, a Spawn, even players like a Cam Young, a Burns that are way, way cheaper down the board here are going to be lower owned as a result. Because when you use a Scotty Scheffler, if you've tried building lineups with him already, it pretty much takes you off the entire top end of the board. So it's pretty much Scotty or even 2 to 3 of these other guys that you're using in case of him. And if you like the more spread out approach, the ownership's still going to be there on all of those guys that you're taking. In fact, not to kind of lump in the entire field together here, but the high owned guys down low are like 34% owned. And quote unquote low-owned guys are like 22 to 24% owned. Towards the bottom end of the board, there's not a very big spread with the ownership outside of a Scotty Scheffler. So I think the ownership this week, it's not maybe as important as what we typically have, because the spread percentage-wise isn't that large across the board. But the big name you have to navigate is Scotty Scheffler. And it's going to look a little bit different if you're in cash or single entries, as opposed to if you're playing in the large field GPPs. But outside of that, and I hate to simplify it this much, it's quite literally play your guys. And if you have a bunch of chalk, you have a bunch of guys that are in that 30 to 35% range, all played together, like 3 or 4 of them out of your 6 players, then think about leaving salary on the table. And I really think that's the way to play in the large hole GPPs this week, is if you want to make sure you're not going to duplicate yourself with a whole bunch of other people, it's just leave like $1,000 on the table, maybe even a little bit more than $1,000 on the table. And while that would normally mean that you're going from guys that are elite tier players to absolute shit players for your regular PGA Tour event, that's not really the case here, because even the players in the 6K range are half decent tour winners, major winners in some cases. I mean, you guys know I like guys like Wyndham Clark. Chris Gotterup's only $7,100 on a week like this. We've got some legit names where if you're leaving that salary on the table, it's not a complete clown lineup like what you'd have for one of these fall series events where you're leaving salary on the table and you're playing some random 6K nobody that doesn't even have PGA Tour status, right? This is the exact opposite of that. And when you leave that salary on the table, it lets you take some more chalk, which is almost unavoidable on a slate like this, and it gives you that differentiation. Now, that strategy, I think, is a little bit more important for those large field GPPs as opposed to those single entries in cash. The duplication risk is just so much lower in single entries in cash that leaving that $1,200 to maybe $1,500 on the table isn't worth it in that sort of scenario. You know, if you duplicate yourself in a single entry with 1 to 2 other people, the payouts aren't that top heavy in those sort of contests where it's as big of a deal as what it is in the large hold GPPs either. So personally, I'll be spending all my salary when I'm playing in any sort of contest that have less than 1,000 entries. Anything over 1,000 entries is probably where you want to start to think about leaving that salary on the table. And we'll start to point out some of the other guys I think that might get steam in some of your single entry contests. Cam Young would be a great example of that. It would not surprise me at all if he was close to 50% in some single entry contests this week. So if you guys see that tomorrow morning, I guess just remember that I told you so on that one. Cam Young, a play that I love, obviously, as a core play, but I think a lot of people in the industry really like a Cam Young this week, and it would kind of shock me if he wasn't higher round than what I'm calling for there. Keegan Bradley, after the Skins game performance, that's part of the reason that I used him as a core play this week as well. I think that he's probably going to get some steam. Sam Burns, I've seen on a lot of betting cards. You got the Bermuda Burns narrative going, but also played really strong golf towards the second half of 2025. He's also only $8,900. You can even use him as a second man into Scotty lineups if you have some value plays in the 6K range that you like using. So I think that he might get a little bit of steam. And then who else? Maybe, I guess that's about it. Down low, I don't think anyone's really getting that much steam. I haven't seen anyone that's overly popular towards the bottom. You can see that I've got guys like Connors, Brian Harmon, perhaps like some of these guys closer to 30%, a little bit higher owned than some of their peers. But even the guys that have some injury risk, even guys like Jordan Spieth that haven't played for 4 to 5 months, I've got over 20% owned. And that's that GPP aspect. That's people trying to quote unquote get different in the large hold GPPs, which is extremely difficult to do other than with leaving salary on the table in a 20 player field like this. And, you know, guys like a Jordan Spieth, guys like a Billy Horschel, for example, and you guys know I'm the Jordan Spieth whisperer. He's my favorite golfer by far in the world. I can't see how he's a good play on a slate like this when he hasn't played professional golf in 5 months. The fact that he's over 20% owned is mind-boggling to me. It makes him probably the easiest fade that I've had in Jordan Spieth in quite some time. I know it's a great golf course for him. I like rooting for my guy, and I'll be totally fine if he wins this event and throws it in my face. In fact, I'll be the happiest I've been probably this entire year because he's my favorite player and he's finally getting back into the winner's circle, but I just don't see it, right? He's probably going to finish in the bottom 5. If we're being quite honest about it. And there are other guys here like a Horschel, like he's been terrible since he returned from injury. If he's going to be over 20% owned, there are some spots where I think you can actually get some leverage on a slate like this. And it's not really with the guys that I'm playing. It's with the guys that I'm actively avoiding in some of my contests. So those are a couple examples of it. There are a few other guys on top of that that also haven't played a lot of golf recently. It's not just that they've taken time off during the fall. A lot of these guys have taken time away from just golf professionally. Some of them have had like life things going on, like injuries with Horschel and Spieth. Straka has had something going on with his family recently, and I'm not going to elaborate on it because it's a bit personal with Straka, but he's had some real personal stuff going on that's been taking himself away from the game. Those are the sort of players that might be sketchy on a week like this. So that's where I'm actively getting some of my leverage. Consider leaving some salary on the table if you guys haven't already. And I think that's really the way to get your differentiation this week. Going on, Jay said, thanks for the breakdown. You say you play a 20 max. So can I deep dive Alex Noren? So, and by the way, with the 20 max in your first question, yeah, I'd say like 12 guys would be a pretty aggressive way to play a 20 max in that fashion. So I like it. That's personally how I'm playing this kind of week. So no pushback there. And then can I deep dive Alex Noren? He's at the top of your model. So yeah, that must mean that you're looking at a lot of the DP World Tour stats then, right? If you're looking at Alex Noren and he's at number 1 in your modeling, which I'm totally fine with because he won multiple times during the fall swing over there. However, it is a different level of golf compared to the PGA Tour side, so you have to normalize it just a little bit. But I do have to say that Alex Noren does grade out particularly well. He has the short game to take on these Bermuda grass around the green surrounds, and he's only $7,400 for someone that's playing stellar golf. I mean, he's number 10 in recent form ranking, so I can't give you that much pushback there. But if you look at the shots gained metrics, a lot of this is because it's from the DP World Tour, but he has no weakness over the last 24 rounds. It's hard to really find any fault there. Over the last 12 measured rounds, let's take a look at that too. He's gaining on approach, gaining with the putter. Could be a little bit better recently with his shots gained off the tee, but this golf course isn't a course where you have to be a bomber to find success. It surely helps. That's why a lot of my plays this week are bomber-centric, especially because in large hold GPPs, I'm trying to get those guys like in top 5, or if they don't top 5, top 10 of them make a shit ton of birdies to get to the top 5 of the Draftkings scoring. I need guys that can take on the par 5s because of that. So I guess that's the only little bit of pushback I'll give you on an Alex Norton is that the course fit might not be the best. He said, you're going to drop $50 props this week for Santa season. There you go. And yeah, I remember when I was at the $50 unit days. Those are good ones. And those were when I wasn't limited on a lot of the sports books. These days, the units are a lot larger, and that's why I get limited so quickly. But $50 unit size sounds great, man. Let's go through this. So we're going to the prop side now. That was it for DFS. So best of luck with all of your DraftKings lineups if that's what you guys are going with this week. But I see a pretty big edge on the betting side this week because not only do we have one tournament to bet with the Hero, we also have the Nedbank and the Crown Australian Open, which we didn't have props for round one for the Crown Australian. It's the first time that they played at Royal Melbourne for a professional stroke play event in like 20-something years. So obviously, they're waiting for some shots gained metrics and some stats to work with before they're going to post a board for round number 2. But we still have the Hero and the Nedbank coming up. So at the top, you have the Hero stats. That's what we're going to go through first here. Scoring average was a little bit better than -2. And as I said with this weather forecast earlier, there's some wind almost every single day. I think it's going to play about -2 for almost every single round. So these averages that we see on the screen here, I think are going to be pretty accurate for this week. So birdie average, because of the 5 par 5s, a couple drivable par 4s, it's almost 5 per round, which is something you would expect at this kind of a course, right? It's a resort style course. They're going to make a shit ton of birdies, especially when it's the world's best players. However, this is the part of the game that everyone forgets about with this golf course. At least if you're newer to golf, maybe you just look at the box score and you don't realize what you're dealing with, is the around the green at this course is hard as fuck. It's maybe the hardest around the green chipping course that they play in the world. And that's not an exaggeration. It is the grainiest Bermuda grass that they play on all the professional circuit, and the greens are 4,000 square foot. They are smaller than Pebble Beach, which the only reason why they're not the quote-unquote smallest greens on the PGA Tour is because this isn't an actual PGA Tour event, right? It's an exhibition event, I suppose, that's put on by Tiger Woods. So tiny greens, which means you miss them a lot more often than you'd like to. Now, if it's completely calm, you're going to hit like 16 greens, and it won't be that much of a problem. But with the little bit of wind that they have in the forecast, that's why it's a 2.5 bogey average. And that's despite this being one of the best fields that you have in all of golf. So you just have to keep that in mind when you're betting props this week. Your guys are going to make a lot of birdies for sure. And I think maybe the best category for overs might be like overs on birdies. But with strokes, there's going to be some over opportunity on strokes, some spots where you can fade the field, and also some spots for bogeys or worse where you can take some overs too, because the sports books, I don't think, are properly accounting for these kind of conditions. And you can see the fairway average and the green averages towards the bottom. We don't have any props to bet on Underdog or Prize Picks for fairways or greens, so we're not going to spend as much time on that. Worth noting, though, that there's only 13 fairways at this golf course. So if they do end up posting some fairway props and perhaps they forget to account for that, that could be something to take advantage of. But they're extremely wide fairways. Despite there being only 13 on property, they do have a 9.44 average. And then the green regulation average, you can see there at 12.1 per round. And that shows you how small those green complexes can be, because that's still with a -2 scoring average, the world's best players out there. That's why this golf course, I think, is sneaky hard and one of my favorite setups that we have the entire year. And it reminds me a lot of the Florida golf courses that we have down here where I live, down here in the southern portion of the state. A lot of developments, a lot of golf courses that are within those developments. And because they don't have all the space to work with, we have Bermuda grass from tip to toe. It's all grain down here. You just learn how to deal with that if you're somebody that's a resident, especially if you're here during the summer. It's when it gets its worst. But the greens are tiny because you don't have that much room to work with either. So this golf course is kind of what I'm used to playing down here in South Florida. And unless you're one of the best chippers that you have in the field, it's going to become a problem at some point. And that's why guys like Scotty Scheffler last year ran away with this thing, right? What did he win by? I forget the exact margin, but I think it was like 6 or 7 strokes when it was all said and done, is because he was hitting all the greens. He wasn't putting himself in trouble. And when he did, he had the short game to get himself out of it. So I think these averages are going to be pretty accurate for the first couple days. And we'll get to some exposure here in a second. But before we get to the actual props up that we're entering, let's go through the Nedbank golf side as well. And that's the DP World Tour event that's going on in South Africa, an extremely difficult golf course. So it's Gary Player Country Club, the Sun course, I believe, and it's a plus 1.22 scoring average from last year, and it plays +1 to +2 pretty much every year at that course. And it is one of the fields that's limited. It is a no-cut event as well at the Nedbank, and because of that, you don't have a whole bunch of scrubs that are teeing it up to screw up that scoring average. So it truly does play over par. I mean, last year the winner was -5, and that was a harder year for sure. I mean, it was maybe the hardest year that we've had over the last 3 years. But even when Max Homa won, I believe, at -19, 2019, a couple years ago, it's still played over par. So as a par 72, it can be a brute. And you can see with the birdie average, only 3.16 per round last year. Now, that was a pretty extreme example because it played plus 1.22, but like 3.5 per round is probably about as high as it's going to get. And then the bogey or worse average was 3.8 per round. Oh, I need a sip of water. That voice crack there is crazy. It was 3.8 per round last year, though. That might go down to like 3.5 per round, but this golf course is still going to be one of the more difficult that we have in all the DP World Tour schedules. So when we get to that board, there's going to be some fades that I think make sense. And in fact, one in particular that we entered for this week. So speaking of, let's actually give you guys a slip to go out there and tail for tomorrow. And the first prop we're going to take is going to be this over on Akshay Bhatia Bogies, who I did play as one of my core plays this week. So it's a bit bittersweet to actually be fading him here on the prop side of things. But it's me recognizing his weakness. He's somebody that on the PGA Tour is number 111 in a bogey avoidance, which is about average for the PGA Tour this year. In fact, a little bit below average in that category. If the average for the field is about 2.5 bogeys or worse per round, then he's a clear overvalue because not only is he worse than the average for the PGA Tour, this is an elite level field. This is 20 of the best players that we have in the PGA Tour. So to be number 111 in the category means you're bottom 5 in the field in that category. So I have him projected closer to 3 bogeys or worse per round. Now, I still think he's going to make a ton of birdies. In fact, he's one of the more aggressive birdie makers that we have in this field. So that's why I still think he's a play in DFS and still why I like him so much in my exposure this week. But that's because he's going to make 5.5 to maybe 6 birdies per round and offset some of that bogey production that he's posting. So with the kind of push equity that we're getting here at 2, I think it's an absolute no-brainer. And then the other prop we're going to take is going to be on the DP World Tour side. So it's going to be this over on Will Zalatoris strokes at 71. And, we mentioned Spieth coming back from injury, the Horsell thing, Straka, maybe not being as focused on golf lately for very good reason. But Will Zalatoris here at 71 strokes is somebody I'm taking for the over, as he's not played golf in professionally, at least in over 5 months at this point. And he's been playing golf for the last 2.5 months at home, just trying to get geared up and back ready to play professional golf. But this is a golf course that played to a 73 average last year. To push this kind of line, he'd have to gain over 2 strokes to last year's average. And even if we only have him playing like 72.5, he'd have to gain 1.5 strokes just to push this sort of number. You'd have to gain like 2.5 to go under it, which is asking a lot from somebody that's playing his first professional round in over 5 months. And I love Willie Z. He's one of my favorite guys out there on tour. He's funny as hell, especially in the recent movie cameos that he's been making. But at 71 strokes, I've got to take his over. And when you take a look at his line on DraftKings, he's at 71.5, and I think it was like minus 130, minus 140 under, which I disagree with. I'd probably have him at 71.5 and even money, like Fanduel has him at. But Fanduel has him at exactly that number, 71.5, and then even money towards both sides, which is 0.5 value. That enough is just a little bit of line value, but also we get the push equity down there at 71. So I'll mix that in there on this sort of a site for a 3x payout across both of those. And the push equity isn't that great with the payouts on Prize Picks, but it's at least better than losing, right? If they only got to 2, or if Will Zalatoris shot a -1 score. So that's an example of the kind of prop value that I've already played for the first day of props. And we're going to have more throughout the rest of the weekend. So make sure you stay tuned to the rest of the live streams that we'll be doing for the rest of the action throughout the weekend. But also make sure to check out my Patreon page, link in the description of the video. Check out all the slips I'm entering as well. Anything on Underdog and Prize Picks to enter over there. I post the reasoning behind it. Also all the stat averages that you saw before. Weather reports giving you a complete breakdown of conditions for every single round. That's where you guys can find all the exposure that I'm taking. But let's go through some Hard Rock Bet stuff as well. I also took this head-to-head for the Ned Bank. And this is going to be a full tournament matchup. So if you're on Hard Rock Bet, you click the Ned Bank, you click on matchups. That's how you can find this tab. And it's Aldrich Potgieter versus Christo Lamprecht. And, Potgieter is my guy, the pot getter, as we call him. He absolute legend, won at the Rocket earlier this year for us. Big ol' outright bet that we cashed at that one. But Christo Lamprecht, I like him too. He's one of my sweeties that we have on the Corn Ferry Tour. He hits the ball a freaking mile, maybe the longest player, even longer than Potgieter actually, which is the crazy part about Lamprecht. However, Lamprecht does that on the Corn Ferry Tour. And on the Corn Ferry Tour, he's an extremely inconsistent player. He misses cuts. He finishes like T45, T50 all the time. But he also has a win on the Corn Ferry Tour. And then he also has another top 5 finish on top of that. So it's not like he sucks. He's kind of like Potgieter on the PGA Tour, because that's what Potgieter's done too, right? He's got a win. He's got a couple other top 5s. I think like 3 top 5s this year. And some pretty big boy golf courses too. So really impressive what Aldrich has done. but one's done it on the PGA Tour against the world's best players. One's done it against, I hate to call them scrubs, but lower tier guys on the Korn Ferry Tour. At minus 120, this is disrespectful towards Pot Guider. He should be minus 175, minus 200 as the favorite in this sort of matchup. So minus 120, I mix it in for a 1-unit bet as well. So on top of the Hard Rock Bet stuff, the Prize Picks Underdog stuff for both the PGA and the Eurogolf side, make sure to check that out on my Patreon page. And of course, for all the DFS stuff that we're going through before, you guys saw the ownership projections for the entire field, but my entire player pool, all my modeling, all the shots gained metrics, event history, recent form that we're going through with those deep dives, you guys can find on the Patreon page as well. But that's all I've got for this week. Best of luck with everything that you guys are going with, whether it's in the large field GPPs or with any of your betting and prop exposure. It's cash out, add to the bankroll, and over the next few days for rounds 2 through 4, we're going to be doing live streams going over all the action for the weekend. So make sure you guys subscribe so you guys don't miss any of that when it drops. Smash that like button if you guys haven't already. And let me see if there's any last second questions to go through. It looks like we're good from that end. So with that being said, best of luck, as I said, guys, and let's have ourselves a week.